Well, it is my pleasure to introduce someone who, of course, needs no introduction to this audience at all. Indeed, he's been introduced several times already. Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart is serving in his 6th term in the United States Congress in various districts. I can't keep quite straight which one you're representing at the moment, but I think it's the 25th. He is a man who has served in previous capacities in public service in this state, in the state legislature. He is a member of the House Appropriations Committee, which, it goes without saying, is a tremendously important committee of the Congress. He is also the co-founder and chair of the Congressional Hispanic Conference. Congressman Diaz-Balart is, as you have heard, an author of the legislation that many of us feel is tremendously important at this particular moment in time. I suspect he will say a few words about it. We're delighted to have him with us. Welcome, Congressman.
Good morning. Good morning. Buenos dias. It's great to be here with you today in this wonderful place. By the way, FIU, which to me is always doing the right thing for the cause of freedom. Despite the fact that it's a refrigerator in here, it's always doing the right things for the cause of freedom. And so let me first again thank you for for being here, but more importantly for what you're doing. You've already heard from a number of my colleagues, so I'll try not to be repetitive. So I'll bring up just a few points. You've heard, and it's absolutely the case, that the cause of and the struggle that the brave people in Venezuela, led by a number of, frankly, heroes and symbolized by the students who are in the streets in Venezuela, has bipartisan support in the United States Congress. And it's not bipartisan support in the sense of just, no, it's aggressive bipartisan support. That's the good news. And it's important because, as you well know, and I've said it and we've heard it before, there's a million ways to say that, but clearly the best friend of tyranny is silence. And luckily in the United States Congress and in this community, we're not going to remain silent. And we're going to continue to show solidarity. And we're going to continue to pressure that regime. And that's good news. But there are a lot of challenges. And I don't have to tell you that. The theme of this conference, which is pressure, sanctions, and strategy, I think is so appropriate. There are some that still believe that you should not sanction and you should not pressure dictatorships, like the Maduro dictatorship. And by the way, let's be very clear. The Maduro dictatorship did not become a Maduro dictatorship in the last 3 months. It was a Chavez dictatorship before that. And so while there are some good news, there is some good news about the solidarity that the United States Congress has. We also have some great challenges. Number one is that we've had a hard time to get this hemisphere. We've had a hard time getting our allies. And yes, estamos entre amigos. We've had a very difficult time getting our own president to understand the reality that has taken place in Venezuela. The reality that has been taking place in Venezuela for years now. And when you're going to confront something, whatever it is, whether it's a disease, whether it's a personal situation, whether it's a tyranny, you have to start by understanding what you're confronting, for God's sake. For years, we've been telling our own administration, you need to understand what we are dealing with. Not only is it a dictatorship, it's a cancer in our hemisphere. It's a cancer that is not only destroying and repressing the Venezuelan people, but it's helping all of those who repress and murder across the hemisphere and across the entire planet. And we live in an era, and by the way, we in Miami, no nos creemos los cuentos, ¿verdad? We in Miami know that. We live in an era of the suitcases of cash going to heads of state and influential people. Cash stolen from the Venezuelan people, that appear all of a sudden, like the one that was caught here in Miami of over $800,000 in cash, one that was caught going to Kirchner in Argentina. So we should, again, first recognize what we're dealing with, recognize that there are going to be folks who have received those suitcases of cash, recognize that there are those who are doing business in Venezuela and want to continue to do business, and there are those that want to do business with Venezuela, which is why we have to redouble our efforts. Because that's what we're confronting. And I go back to what I was saying. Those that receive cash, have received cash, want to do business, those are accomplices of the blood that Maduro is shedding in Venezuela. And while not necessarily direct accomplices, those that remain silent, those that remain indifferent, those that remain giving excuses and helping buy time to the murderers in Venezuela and in Cuba, though may not be directly accomplices, are as close to it as one can be. So, good news and bad news, right? Good news is solidarity, bipartisan solidarity in Congress. Good news is that the U.S. Congress, bipartisan, understands that we have to pressure, and one of the ways to do that is by sanctioning. Bad news is what I just mentioned. And also bad news is that when we have an administration here, and I say this with great pain, that understands, here's the good news again, that sanctions work, that they can be effective, that they're essential, that they're an essential tool in U.S. foreign policy, because our administration uses them all the time. Today, with the situation in Croatia, for some reason, when it comes to the suffering of the Venezuelan people, the attitude of our president is, we need more time. We need to continue to talk. We need to dialogue. En primer lugar, no es un diálogo, es un monólogo. All right? Because we're all in favor of talks and conversations. But what's the goal? Does anybody believe that, whether it's Castro or Maduro, and I mentioned Castro and Maduro because it's one and the same, huh? Does anybody believe that they're going to talk their way out of power? That they're going to freely give in? That they're just kind of pretending to be dictators for just over a decade? Or does anybody think that the only reason they're willing to talk is, and the only things they're willing to talk about is how they stay in power? Folks, this is not rocket science. And maybe, well, maybe it's because this administration, our administration, doesn't believe in sanctions. Well, they sure as hell believe in sanctions in Croatia. And let me go back for a few years, because maybe they don't believe in sanctions, I don't know, in our hemisphere. Let me go back a few years. You all recall the constitutional crisis in Honduras. Remember that? Remember that when that started, and by the way, once again, the cancer, right? When that started, when you had Castro and Chavez plotting to impose an anti-American Marxist dictatorship in Honduras, you remember what happened? The Honduran people stood up. The institutions, following their constitution, stood up. They stood up, and all of the political parties, including Zelaya's political party, stood up. And the Attorney General stood up, and the Supreme Court, and everybody in Honduras said, we're not going to allow this to happen. But yet Chavez and Castro were intent on having Honduras fall to a dictatorship. Remember how long it took our own president to impose sanctions on Honduras? Do you remember how long it took our president to deny visas to the members of the Supreme Court to the members of the Electoral Council, to the President, that history has shown we're on the right side because they prevailed despite that? So here's the question. If in Honduras, our administration here immediately applied sanctions, immediately applied pressure, why the double standard? And it's a double standard in the most perverse way, because our president imposed sanctions on those who were trying to preserve democracy and who, by the way, succeeded. But for some reason, when students are being butchered in the streets of Caracas and Carabobo and elsewhere, we need more time. That's for a different conversation. Why? So, and I mention this is not a partisan issue. We do not have a problem in the United States Congress understanding what is happening in Venezuela and what we must do. We do not have that problem in the Congress of the United States. But that's why your role is so important, because we in Congress are going to continue in a united, bipartisan, aggressive way. We've done resolutions in solidarity. We've passed them. We're doing legislation. We are convinced we're going to pass it, and we're going to now try to bring that to the floor, to the House, as soon as possible. But we need your help. We need everybody to understand that what is happening in Venezuela is unacceptable, and that those who refuse to acknowledge it, though may not be accomplices, need to understand that we will not tolerate it. The world needs to understand that we are united in this effort. You remember a little while ago, the efforts to try to divide the Venezuelan people in Venezuela or in exile are always going to be there. But we are going to continue to be united. So again, yes, we think, we hope, and with your help, that we're going to get sanctions against those who commit the atrocities in Venezuela. We're going to continue to speak out. We're going to continue to contact our colleagues around the planet who believe in freedom and democracy. But as I end with how I started. And I had some prepared remarks, but I just figured, let me just, estamos entre amigos. This, as you know, is a battle. It's a battle that's taking place in the streets of Venezuela, which is going to continue. And there are only two solutions here. Only two solutions here. Either the people of Venezuela, those who have inherited the spirit of Simón Bolívar, prevail in their struggle, or evil prevails in Venezuela. That's what's at stake here. This is very simple. And I need to thank you for your solidarity. I need to thank you for sticking together. I need to thank you individually. I wish I could mention all of you around the table. There's one, look, I see Patricia Andrade, who's not on the table, but who for years, when it wasn't in the news, would constantly come to my office with lists of political prisoners for years, and of detainees. So every single one of you, thank you for what you're doing. I know that just like the Venezuelan people in Venezuela, and I know because I've talked to them, they feel alone. They are not. I know all of us sometimes feel depressed because we feel alone, but we are not. And I am absolutely convinced that in Venezuela, because of the heroism of the people there, and because of this bipartisan solidarity that exists here in the United States, with a few exceptions, Venezuela will be free once again. Venezuelans will be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor. will be able to protest, will be able to, by the way, be able to walk the streets in not only in freedom, but in security. And as one who understands that this has already been a long effort and maybe a little bit longer, please rest assured that I will do everything with my colleagues, everything in our power, to not remain silent, to not be quieted, to not stop struggling and fighting until that day that is inevitable, which is that the cancer in our hemisphere, which is, again, the brain trust in Havana or the deep pockets stolen from the Venezuelan people, those two cancers will eventually be in the heap of the garbage heap of history, because we are united, because we will not be silenced, and because in our hemisphere we have heroes who are willing to do whatever it takes to regain their freedom. So thank you so very much. Thank you for your activism. Thank you for your involvement. God bless you all. Thank you.